All right. Welcome everyone to week 4 of Intro to iOS. So today, for those who just walked in, I asked that you guys download this. Go to lecture 4, UITableViews. Down here, we have a lecture 4.zip file. It's a starter code for today's lecture. We're not asking you guys to code anything today. We're just asking you guys to follow along with the code that we have there. Once you run it, it should look something like this. It's a very colorful project. And the bottom part is like horizontally scrollable. I'll explain why that is in a bit, but for now, just make sure you have all that. And yeah. So today we're going to be talking about table views. So table views are another kind of view that are very important in app development. You know, as we evolved from just going from one view to another view, we want to have like a little bit more detail. We want to add more detail to our views. So how do we actually do that? Well, we can do that through table views. So UITableViews, like I said, are a type of view. They are used to represent a list of scrollable items. They have a lot of data inside them. They work with classes and delegates to allow interactions between view controllers and the table itself. And they're a really useful tool within app development. A student came to me earlier asking me like if these like table views didn't exist, we would need like a million buttons on our screen to actually like interact like with something like Spotify. Like instead of having to create a million buttons to use an app like Spotify, we instead create these things called table views that sort of act as like a collection of these like buttons. But they're also useful to present information. These are what table views look like specifically. So like I said on the right, Spotify is just a table of songs. So each one of these, even though it might not be that clear, is like divisible by like cells. So like every song title, every like green button, every like album name, or like artist name is that itself like one cell. Same thing with like these setting cells here on the left. They're a little bit more divisible. You can see the difference. You can see the little gray line here that separates them. Each one of them are their own cells, and these cells are scrollable. And what we mean by scrollable is that like you could scroll up and down through your settings app. If you open your phone right now and go to settings, like you could scroll up and down and you could see all these different kinds of cells. So not all cells are the same, obviously, like between these two things. And you can make cells as detailed as you want. And like I said, they're a really useful tool in app development because they allow you to present different kinds of information and a lot of information that looks pretty much the same. Like a lot of these cells look almost identical. It's like just the icons that change, the text that changes, but the rest of the looks are basically like they're the same. So what consists of a UI table view? Every table view has its own number of sections, and then each section is broken down into rows, and each row has a corresponding cell. So what does that look like? In the settings app, we have like 3 different sections here on this view on the screen, and every one of these sections, as you could tell, you could tell they're sections because they're kind of like broken off a little bit weirdly. But every one of these sections has their own cell. So as you can see in section 1, we have like 5 cells. Section 2, we have 4. Section 0, we only have like 1 kind of cell. And each one of these like sections have their own row. So the first section has like 1 row, the other one has 5, the other one has 4. And that's how we could kind of like we could divide all of our information even more like through sections and through rows. So there's a lot of way to like divide all of the information that we want to show. We don't really use sections that much in this course, but they're very interesting to use in the case that you want to use like table views to present a lot of different kinds of information. Like Spotify, for example, doesn't really have any kinds of sections like that. They all present the same homogeneous like song cell. So you don't really have sections in that setting. But in the settings app, in the settings like view controller screen, we actually have this kind of like section division. But that's like the nitty-gritty of table views. And also every table view has like its own area. So as you can see here, this table view consists of like the bottom of the phone screen to like a little bit under the top of the phone screen. So I'll show it a little bit in the app that we have here. This top scrollable part, that itself is a table view. Everything that's red, the red part behind it is a table view. That's a table view container that contains like every one of these cells. So that red coloring behind this like view here, that tells you how big the table view is. So the table view is like half the size of my screen. And yeah. And we also have cells consisting of each row. And so one of the big questions is like, how do they actually work? So every table view has its own table view controller, its own data source object, so delegate object, and the cells. All of these things come together to actually create a table view. And this is some code that is involved with actually creating a table view. So to kind of give you some context, in this app, there's a lot of code. There's a lot of code written here, but all we're going to be focusing on today is the stuff, or this like focusing on in this first part of the lecture is the stuff that says table view, and the stuff that's grouped together that says table view. So basically up here, if you notice in the code, let me like increase the font size a bit. We have this thing called the table view. So we like just like any other view, we create an instance of it within our view controller. We have this data names, which is like the data that we're going to be putting into our table view. It's just an array of strings. And we have this thing called the table reuse identifier. So this should not be what it is. It could be like this table reuse identifier could be whatever. You can literally like name, like conventionally it's called like table reuse identifier, but this string could be anything you want it to be, so long as it's like a unique string compared to all the other identifiers that you have in your file. And what you use this for is to differentiate between your different kinds of cells. So in a table view, I'm not going to draw anything actually. In a table view, like with the sections, right? If I were to go back to the slides, talking about like the sections, like that first section up here, this section has a whole different kind of cell than the other sections. And so when we're loading these cells, when we're trying to create these cells, we want to make sure that our code understands the difference between like the different kinds of cells. And the way it does that is with this like table reuse identifier. So like all these rows over here, these rows might have like their own, they might have their own reuse identifier, and they might be the same as like these rows in section 2, but section 0 for sure has like a different reuse identifier because it's a whole different cell. So that's the reason we use these table reuse identifiers, and we usually set it up in this way. So yeah. What else? Oh, too far. We also have to, you know, just like all other views, we have to make sure the translate auto resizing mask constraints is false. And then we add this table view to our subview. And what kind of specific setup do we need for our table view? Because we don't just do the things that we saw on the last slide. We also have to configure a lot more things. So all of these, I'll show you in code right now. Basically, that's this whole section here. This whole section. I have to specify what data is going into my cells. So just to be clear, this top half of my screen is a table view. The bottom half is a whole other collection view. We're not going to talk about that yet. We're going to talk about that later. The top half, you could see like the constraints here. Table view is the top anchor is equal to the view's top anchor. The height anchor is equal to half of the view's height anchor. So the table view takes up half of the height of my view. And the leading anchor is equal to the view's leading anchor. Trailing anchor is equal to the view's trailing anchor. And here I set the background color to be red. So like I said earlier, this table view alone is red. Like if I remove this data source comment, if I remove that like line that says data source, it'll still work. It's just that I'll have no cells. So as you can see, all the red is representing what the table view actually is. So that's the table view. And the blue stuff, the things on top of it are the cells. So like I said, the translate auto resizing mask constraints must be set to false. And we have this line, table view.register table view cell.cell for cell reuse identifier. So that's a mouthful. What are we saying here? So what I'm saying here is that for this table view, I want to make sure that every table view has a specific kind of cell. So what's cool about like these table views and collection views is that you could set like a design for any specific kind of cell, and then tell your table view, tell any like collection you have, like you could tell your table view, hey, this is the kind of like kind of layout that I want my cell to have. Make sure that all the other cells within my table view have the same layout. And what does this layout look like? So if we open up table view cell, this is the class that tells us how our table view cell looks like. So as you could see in this table view cell, which is of type UITableView cell, whenever you see a colon, like in any kind of Swift code, you could think of that as the same as saying like a type of. So this thing that's called a table view cell is a type of UITableView cell. And we have like a name label. And very similar to our view did load and our view controller, we have this function override init, which has a style, basically the style of the cell and the reuse identifier. You don't have to worry about this too much, it's just some boilerplate code. And then you always have to call super.init right after. But basically the rest of it is the same thing as is a similar code as you would have in a view controller and a view did load. So in this like whole text of code, which is representative of my one cell, I have to think now like this view is like what I'm constraining things is like with respect to like the cell itself. So my name label, every cell has its own name label. Translate auto resize max change to false. The font is they're all 24. They're all aligned in the center. And instead of view.add subview, I do content view.add subview name label. The same thing as saying like cell.add subview name label. I'm adding this label to the cells themselves. And then I'm saying set the content view of the cells to be blue. That way you guys could see the cells. And then I call setup constraints. And this is setup constraints. It's the same thing as like any other setup constraints that we have. We have the name label stop anchor constraining to the content view stop anchor, the leading anchor constrained to the content views leading anchor, trailing to trailing, bottom to bottom. And the content view, like I said earlier, is like the same thing as a cell. The content view is synonymous with the cell. So I'm saying the name label is stretching itself to be like the size of my entire cell. And right now my cell consists of like the entire like screen almost. The width, my cell has the width of the screen, and it has a height that I've already written out in another piece of code that I'll go over in a second. And if you notice here at the bottom, we'll get back to this, but we have this configure function that sets up the text for my name label. So as you could tell, like every one of my like name labels here, every one of my cells has a different name in it. And how do I actually configure all these different names? I do it with this function configure. I say name label.text is equal to like some name. And basically what I'm going to be doing is like creating a loop that loops through my list of names like I have here in my view controller. My view controller, I have this list of names. And for every name, I'm basically going to be configuring a cell with each one of these names: Elvis, Alden, Tiffany, all of them. But this is how I register a cell. I just wanted to go into depth like of how like a table view cell file is like made, or how it should look like. So it's like a table view. So you call this anything. You could really call this like, I don't know, anything. But the thing is that it conforms to like this colon, has this colon that says it's a type of UITableView cell. So that way, this is the only way that you'll actually be able to create classes that are fit for a cell, and that way you could define how the cell looks like. You could say like what the color of the cell is. You could say what goes into my cell, how it's supposed to be laid out, and then you register that type of cell to be a part of your specific table view here. And then you finally add that table view to your subview or to your view. Yeah.
Where do we kind of see the names?
So these names actually correspond to like this extension here. I'll go into this in more detail, but basically I'm like the data source functions are what tie my view controller to telling that table view what data goes into it. So these functions here like are telling that table view, hey, this is the data that you're going to be putting inside you. And this is how we're going to be configuring. Notice how here we have this cell.configure. We call the cell.configure here when we're setting up each one of the cells. So yeah, I'll go into that in like 1 second. But before I go on, does everything I talked about make sense? Does anybody else have any other questions? Yeah.
As you scroll.
No, they're loaded as you scroll. That's a great question. So you don't actually load all these cells at the same time. As you could tell, like some of the cells when I scroll up disappear. Like Alden's cell disappears. And my cell too. My cell disappears because my name's Elvis. If you didn't know. But yeah, so what happens to those cells? Those cells actually like get deleted, or they don't actually get deleted. No, that's not the right word. At any moment in time on this screen specifically, I have four cells being presented all at once: Tiffany, Justin, Jennifer, and Antoinette. So when I scroll up and that bottom cell disappears, when Antoinette disappears, it immediately replaces the cell. It immediately replaces that cell that Alden is. So at any time, we only have like four cell objects. Like we have like a lot of data. We have like we have 6 names, but at any time of our phone's lifespan, we're only using 4 cell objects. And that's kind of a tricky thing to like wrap your head around. The reason we do that is because we don't want to create it's like we don't want to have like 500 boxes for our 500 songs in our playlist. At most, we're only going to be showing like 4 of those things. We're only going to be showing 4 names. So why should I have like 100 boxes for like my 100 songs if I'm only showing 5? So instead, what I do is I create 4 different boxes, and then when one of the boxes like leaves the screen, when one of the boxes like goes under, it kind of comes back up and is recycled to create my cell, the Elvis cell. And so at any point in time, we only really have 4 cell objects created at once. Yeah.
How does it decide like which one is part of the board? There's like really bad boxes.
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so I kind of lied. I lied. There's not 4, there's 5. There's 5 boxes. Like conceptually, I thought it'd be easier to talk about like 5 or talk about 4, but there are 5 because even if it's like just a little bit of the half, like that's still getting made. So they're actually like 5 objects. It's just you can't really see it. Like right now they're like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. So at any point in time, there are 5. Yeah, they're always 5. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, cool. But yeah, so that's what we need to do to set up this like UI table view. So yeah, so one of the important lines here is like actually setting the data source of our table view to be the self. So what this actually means is that I'm telling the table view, hey, like the data that you're going to be putting into your cells is going to be coming from me. So if I go back to the code, table view dot data source equal to self. Like if I commented this out earlier, like no cells are going to be appearing, and it's because all of the data there are specific functions that come tied with data source. So I didn't talk about them earlier, but these functions down here, we have to create a kind of extension to implement these functions like number of rows and sections and self where we're at. Because if I were to comment this out and I were to run it, as you could see, like table view dot data source is equal to self is going to throw me an error. It's going to say like cannot assign value. Basically, what this error means is that I didn't implement the right functions that I had to. So if I uncomment like just the extension, it's going to yell at me again. It's going to say like the view controller doesn't conform to the protocols. Just like how in delegation in the last lecture, there were some protocol subs that we had to implement because by saying view controller like conforms to UITableView data source, I have to include all of the functions that correspond to like my UITableView data source protocol. So and there are functions that I have to implement, and like self row is one of them. But my self row function is this one, so I don't actually need this one. So that's my self row function. Oh, why is this still going? And it's telling me I need another. What was this one? Okay, yeah. It's telling me I need another function, which is like the number of rows in section. And that's exactly right. But I already include these two functions, so you don't actually have to see that. I just want to show you like these function when I write this line of code like data source, I'm required to write these functions here at the bottom because I have to make an extension. Like because my view controller, if I'm saying that data source is coming from me, then that means I have to include this extension, which then means I have to include these functions that tell the table view how to set itself up. As you can see, one of the functions is called number of rows in section. Number of rows in section, if I were to run this, tells me how many rows like are actually in my table view. So as you can see, I have equal amounts of like rows as data elements. If I were to make this like 3 instead, I would only have 3 things now in my table view. If I were to make it 2, if I make it 1, I would only have 1 cell. And so we always want to make sure that our number of rows in section is equal to the items in the section. And because we only have one section here, the items is names.count. That's how many items we have in our one section. That's how we can ensure that there are just as many cells as there are, or there are just as many there are just as many cells as there are items that we want to present. And then here below that, we have this thing called cell for row app. What this function does is a lot. It takes it does an iflet. So this is code that I wrote. The whole function, the function doesn't come with this code here that I wrote. So I'll break it down line by line. The if let cell like table view .dq reusable cell. Basically, like what I'm doing is I'm as the name suggests, I'm dequeuing a cell because like I mentioned earlier, when I scroll up, that cell, my cell disappears. Like right when it reaches Alden, my cell disappears. So I don't want to keep that cell object there, like in memory. Because if I have like a million kinds of cells, that's gonna take up a lot of memory on my phone. And it's gonna be pointless because those cells they're not presenting anything. Like nobody's seeing those cells. So what's the point of having them? So instead, what the phone does is it removes those cells and it recycles them. It puts them back at the bottom when you scroll up, and it creates that cell Antoinette. So like when I disappear, Antoinette just gets made, I think. Basically, like when one cell disappears, another one's created. That way, like I'm actually like having the most optimal amount of like cells at a time to present the information that's like necessary, like the only necessary information that's there. Like I'm not presenting like 100 names here. I'm presenting like at most like 5 or 6. However many cells are visible is like however many cells I could see on the screen is however many cells I'll have throughout my entire app's life cycle. And so that's what I'm saying here. I'm dequeuing, like when one of the cells disappears, I'm dequeuing that cell with an identifier, like table reuse identifier, the same string that we made up here. I'm dequeuing it with that string. Okay, where was I? Okay, I'm dequeuing it with that string because I have to make sure that the table view that I'm looking at is the same kind of table view that like I'm asking for within my table view function. Because like I said, I could have multiple sections that have different kinds of table view cells, like I mentioned earlier up here. Like section 0 has a whole other cell compared to the other sections. So they both all like this has a different reuse identifier than this one. So if I dequeue this one, I want to make sure that I'm not using like one of these cells to replace it, because that would give me an error because they're two totally different looking cells, so they're not the same. So they have different reuse identifiers. So I want to make sure I'm using I want to make sure I'm using the right cell for my table view by calling the identifier table reuse identifier. And I have to do for index path. Index path is basically like the type, like the cell, like where the cell is exactly, like what number cell I guess we're talking about. Since there are only 6 cells, like index path kind of corresponds to like either one of those 6 cells. And this last part, as table view cell, is basically saying I'm gonna dequeue this cell as a type of table view cell because only then could I access my table view functions. And one of them is going to be the configure function. So if I uncomment this line, this one. When I uncomment these lines now, I'm doing cell.configure for each one of my cells. And here, I'll put this breakpoint here. That way you guys can see how many times this cell.configure is called. Even though there's no for loop, this cell.configure function is being called like 6 times. So if I count, there's like 1, there's this play button here at the bottom that runs until it hits the breakpoint again. And so when I press it, it hits it again. I clicked it once, believe me, and it hit the breakpoint again. That means it's going on to the second iteration of my cell.configure. So it's going on to the second name. Then I hit it like 1 more time. So I hit it 3 times. I hit it twice. I hit it 3 times. I hit it 4 times, 5. So it's only, as you can tell, it's only hitting 5 times because there are only 5 different cells there at a time, right? It's not hitting 7 times, it's hitting 5 times because you can only see 5 cells at a time. So your cell.configure is going to run for however many cells that there are to be presented, not for however much data that you have. And then you're returning that cell. Because I'm using an if let, I'm not going to be always sure that my table view, like I'm not going to be sure that the dequeuing like with identifier is actually there. Because what if it's the wrong identifier? What if it's a whole other cell? Then I'm not gonna be able to do the cell.configure stuff like I wanted to. So instead, I'm gonna return like an empty table view cell, which is just like a brand new table view cell for my table view to use when I want to create a new cell. Because sometimes I actually do I have to create 5 cells. So eventually, like this is gonna hit.
Question.
Yeah.
What if you scroll that now? Will that run the function again?
Yeah, it will. I just tried scrolling. Yeah. So that's a great question. When I scroll down, it configured this function here at the bottom because it dequeued that cell on top and put it at the bottom. So if I scroll up now, oh, yeah, if I scroll up, I wonder what is configuring.
The bottom one is DQ. Right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. The bottom one Okay. Let me try running that again. So right now I have 5 cells there, right? So when I scroll up like enough and I let go, it notices that last cell at the bottom, or the last 2 cells, the last cell at the bottom like fell off the table view. So I don't need that cell no more. So it's just deleted, and not deleted, but it's going to be recycled when I come back up and I need to see those cells again. And as you can see, I clicked it once because it has to get the Alden cell, but then it also has to get the other cell that comes after Alden. I forgot the name, but it's oh yeah. Oh well, it has to do with Tiffany, Justin, and like it has to do with Justin and like other one at the bottom. So okay, let me do it again. If I scroll up enough, okay, I'm at the Justin cell, and then I let go. It's gonna hit the configure because it's got to configure that cell below Justin, and it only configures once. So it's a really interesting thing, like being able to configure these different kinds of cells, and that's just one way that you could configure that cell. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So if I were to comment this out like entirely, oh, actually not that one. Oh, wrong one. If I were to comment this one out, then it'll say like cannot assign, and it'll give me like an option to fix like the data source thing, and it'll include it up here at the top of my view controller. It'll include it up here like as another extension, and then I could write the same functions up here and it'll do the same thing. But when we start having like many different table view cells, and when we start having like a lot of these different functions for the same table view, because we might have like 2, 3, 4 different kinds of table views within our view controller, and we're gonna get confused because none of these functions have like a name, have a specific name to like identify them. So instead, what we do is we create the extension. I guess it is similar to extends, I think, right? Wait, Alden, is it similar to extends? Extension is extension similar to extends? Yeah, I think it is. I want to say it is because it's like the same idea as including the UI. It's the same idea as including like the UI table view data source like up here, Except it's just a lot neater for us to have like our code here. That way we could actually tell like, okay, these are where my table view data source functions are. And these are where my like setup constraints functions are. Because in the long run, if you have too many of these functions in the same place, then it's going to get confusing. Yeah, so it's a style preference. But yeah. So let me go back. So we also have these other functions that correspond to the UITableView delegate. So as you guys might have noticed earlier, I gotta stop this breakpoint. Oops. As you guys might have noticed earlier, I set the table view delegate to be self. And by setting the delegate to be the self, I'm saying that my table view will take care of also like the information that the table view wants to pass to my view. Now I didn't pass any information from my table view to my view yet. We're gonna be doing that in demo, but we also want to like the UITableView data source extension that we did. We also want to create an extension for the UITableView delegate. And one of the functions that comes with the UITableView delegate is this height for row at function. So if I change this height for row at like to like 20, it sets up the height for my cells. And if I comment it out, it automatically sets the height for however big my label is. So however big the objects are within my cell is however big my cells are going to be. So because my label automatically comes with like a height, I don't have to assign my cells an individual height. However, I could say like these pixels are like 40 cells large. And they'll look like that. If I can make them like 150, they'll be even thicker. And now there's only 3 cells at a time. I like this view actually more. Yeah, I'm gonna keep it like that. So that's another kind of implementation that we could have for like setting the height. And yeah, the register, we already talked about registering. So dequeuing, just to kind of like really drive that point in. We don't want to render 200 cells if we have 2000 or 2000 songs if we have 2000 cells. Wait, no, we don't want to render 2000 cells if we have 2000 songs because it takes up a lot of memory. So is the app. So we do this thing called dequeuing. So at any point in time in our app, we have like X amount of cells presented. And once one of those cells falls above, it's automatically used to go back at the bottom of my table view and load in the bottom like information that should be coming up. If I'm scrolling like this way, then all of the cells from the bottom should be getting loaded in and the top like deleted in a sense. And if I scroll down, then all the cells below should like get put all the way back to the top of my view, to the what's my mouse? Okay, my mouse is in there. It should be put back to the top of my table view controller. That way it's able to be reused to create those cells. And just to rehash the steps, you're initializing the layout of your table view. You're creating a custom cell. So because this cell does not, what is it? This table view cell file does not come to you for free. You have to make it. You have to make all of this. And you have to register your table view to match that cell, set the table view's data source and delegate, and then conform your view controller to that table view data source and table view delegate functions. That way you could set up all the data and stuff. And to quickly go over the next slides, we have these other things called collection views. Okay, I'm gonna go into collection views. These are short slides because collection views are basically the same thing. So collection views, instead of thinking about it like a table now, actually, before I move on to the collection views, does anybody have any questions on table views? Anything about the table view code? Yeah.
Curiosity question. Like Spotify, right?
Yeah.
Like, is the app actually written in script and it uses like table views? Because like what's the same and what do? Like,
Yeah, so I think I'm not entirely sure what language or what framework Spotify uses, but because there's a reason that they might look the same. They might have really good Android developers and really good iOS developers. Like just because you make an iOS app doesn't mean that, at least when we make iOS apps here, doesn't mean that you could just like use like some kind of like Google Translate to like translate that code into Android and then automatically it's the same. That usually happens because they have really good teams of Android developers and like Spotify and iOS developers. That's how we do things on our team. I think the Eatery app is compatible for both like iOS and Android, and they look fairly the same, but they have two whole like different like environments to create these apps in. However, there are frameworks that you can create like Android and iOS apps using the same like code. It's one of the main ones is called like React Native. React Native allows you to create iOS apps and Android apps. But when you start thinking long term, thinking like really trying to scale your app to like many users, you start running into errors and running into issues when trying to create apps in like some things like React Native, because a lot of the intricate errors that you might be getting like would be avoidable had you just done like UIK kind of development, Swift kind of development. And it's just because like Swift is more, it's more user friendly for the programmer when you're trying to code apps like for specific iOS apps. It's because you don't have to think about Android apps when you're coding in UIK. You only think about iOS apps. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. But yeah, any other table view questions before we move on? Okay, cool. So collection views. They're used to display mainly grids of items. Like say you don't want a table, say you want like grids, then they're kind of the same idea. Like this is a collection view, not a table view. Table views have rows and they also have items. So as you see here, every single one of these things, it's like it's a different kind of item. And these are just some examples of what collection views might look like. So collection views, just like table views, have their own section. And so how do we actually set up a collection view? So very similarly to the table views. Well, what I actually did here for the sake of the demo was I made a collection view like this because it wouldn't let me do this. If I try doing this, it gives me an error. So I just said collection view is a type. Yeah, it gives me errors when I do that. So basically what I'm saying here is that my collection view is a type. Like this var collection view is a type of collection view. And down here, I'm saying my collection view is equal to a UI collection view with a frame of 0 and collection view layout, shape layout. And shape layout is just this like kind of UI collection view flow layout, which has this thing called the minimum line spacing, minimum interim spacing, and scroll direction. The spacing is just how far away like the cells are from each other. Oh yeah, sorry.
Oh, sorry. How's collection view?
So collection views, you see how table views could like scroll like this. Collection views could scroll like this. That's one of the major differences. And that's not the only thing though. Like you could also, you have a lot more freedom with like how your cells actually look like. Like if you could tell here, like cells are like, they look distinct. Like you can see a clear difference between each cell. However, with table views, they all look kind of like glued together. There's a way to get around the glued together part of table views. However, it's a little bit hard. So usually people use collection views a lot more than table views for these kinds of things. But one of the major things is like the horizontal scrolling. It's like you could do it in table views. It's really hard though. Collection views is a lot easier to use for like horizontal scrolling. But yeah, any other questions? Cool. So yeah, collection views have this thing called a UI collection view flow layout. We also register a collection view cell. So I created this collection view cell, almost the same as my table view cell. Has a name label, background color, translate, fonts. Yeah, basically identical code. Except this time it's a UI collection view cell instead of a UI table view cell. And I also have the same idea. Data source is equal to self, delegate is equal to self. And as you can see, the collection view has a background color green, which is much more easily seen here in this example. The background color is green. And then the cells, individual cells are pink. I made them, oh yeah, that's the other thing. I made them pink here because I thought that looked cooler. Yeah, I made the labels pink. But same idea. And so I set them up like this: collection view top anchor, leading, trailing. So this the collection view is basically it fills up the rest of the screen below the table view. That's what these constraints mean. And here are the functions that are necessary to implement when creating a collection view. So we have this new function, number of items in section. So this tells me how many, it's like the same idea as number of rows in section, except instead of rows, it's items. And the number of items is equal to the names dot count is equal to the number of cells that I have. So if I make this like 2, I'll only have 2 cells there at the bottom, and then it won't look as cool. So I have like me and Alden. So usually what we do is we return names.count. And this extension comes from setting up my collection view.data source to be self. This line of code, collection view.data source. So collection view.data source here. Where is that? Yeah, so collection view.data source is how I implement these UI collection view data source functions. I have this cell for item at now, where I dequeue this cell for reuse ID collection view reuse ID, and I say it is a type of collection view cell, and then I call cell.configure for each one of these cells. And again, if I set a breakpoint there, this is going to be more interesting because now I clicked it once, I clicked it twice. Let me like remove this. I click the cell. Okay, I click the cell collection view cell twice. And it makes sense because I only have like 2 cells being presented at a time. So when I configure the cells for my collection view, I only configure for however many cells that I have currently presented on my screen. And currently I only have 2 cells that I need to configure. And in the case that I don't have a cell there, I return a UI collection view cell, which usually never happens. And then I have this other weird extension based off this this other collection view that delegate is equal to self function or self line of code. Because I set the delegate equal to self, I have to write like this function, the functions that come with the UI collection view data flow layout, very specific name, but this is basically telling you how your cells are going to be set up. So my collection view has a this kind of extension has a function size for item at, which tells me how big my items are, how big my cell is. And in this function, I'm supposed to return this thing called the CG size, which is the size of like the cells themselves. So unlike the table view, my collection view can't automatically assume what the size of my cells are. So instead, I define what the size is, like in a very detailed way. I say the size is equal to the collection view's frame.width. So the width of my collection view, half of that, like minus 10 pixels, and then half of that is going to be equal to the square size of my cell. And then I return like CG with the width of size and height of size. I could also say like I could say a width of size and height of size over 2. And then, oh God, my breakpoint. And if I run it, oh, that's kind of weird. That should not have happened, I want to say. Okay, I think my map might have gotten confused. Forget I did that, but I was trying to divide the size by 2 to show you that they could be like squished. I won't do that for now. But that's basically how you set up a collection view. Like I said, you set the data source to be self, just like a table view. You have number of rows in section and self for row out in your UITableView data source protocol. So when you create collection view, when you say collection view that data source is equal to self, that requires you to implement these functions within your view controller then. And each one of these functions, like number of rows tells you, number of items in section tells you how many cells you have in your, how many items you have within your collection view. And then cell for item at tells you how to set up each one of these different like item cells. So this is just another way to represent the section item. And these are just some differences, you could scroll in both directions. You could adjust the width and height of each cell. And you could create UI table views with collection views, but not the other way around. So that's why a lot of people like using collection views more than table views. Oh, just to mention, oh yeah, talk about this a bit more. Minimum line spacing is the spacing between your cells. Minimum interim spacing is a space between your cells horizontally. So interim is horizontally and minimum line spacing is vertically. So this is just the code that corresponds to those. So just a last thing, my collection view. Okay, yeah, this layout stuff, right? Let's talk about this a bit more. My layout stuff has this thing called spacing. Spacing I define up here to be 50. I can also make it at like 100. And I think this would actually fix like this width thing. So if I make the width half, make the height half. Okay, wait, I'm gonna make this like crazy number. Okay, now my cells like are like half, they look kind of like how I wanted them to. Basically the minimum interim or the minimum line spacing was too small, so like it fit as many cells as it could into like my collection view, which I didn't want it to do. I wanted them to look kind of like this. So this is how you could kind of like detail your cells a bit more. And you could also change the scroll direction by simply doing like collection view or no, shape layout dot scroll direction with the dot vertical. And now it's like scrollable in the vertical direction. That's basically a table view. Yeah. Any last questions? That's all I had to present.